Welcome back to the final session of Trails of Cold Steel 4. It's going to be a pretty short session today, hopefully without any technical glitches, but we're going to be finishing off the rest of 3-9, or 3 and 9. We have a few more chapters to go, and then after that we will call it, and I will then see you guys next time for the start of a new project. It won't be Falcom related, but I think it'll be still fun nonetheless. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Chapter 6, 9 of Swords. My mother died soon after I was born. From that point, it was just me, my older brother, and our dad. As far back as I can remember, my dad was a monster. He took the mirror Mom left us and used it entirely for himself, spending each day drinking it away. He made no effort to put it to good use, to do anything that might help our family. And when he was in a bad mood, what little safe haven we had was violently wrested away. My brother acted more like a parent to me than my dad ever did. Whether at home or out somewhere else, he always protected me. I really hated that house, but I always felt like it was bearable when he was there by my side. Those days didn't last for long, however. I was still quite young when the household ran out of money, and Dad decided to put us to work. There weren't many options for a child to earn much mira, though, and even between my brother and I, our income barely made a scratch in our mounting debt. One day, my brother vanished and Dad announced he had let him spread his wings. In other words, he had abandoned him. It was at that point I stopped thinking of that monster as my family. Even in such an awful situation, I still held on to the idea that my brother would come back to me one day. That meant my only option was to stay there until he did. 3 long years later, I finally received a letter from him. He wrote that he was in a miserable place, but that he was managing to stay alive. I was able to send him a reply via the same method, thrilled to have a connection with him once again. I eventually found out he was being forced to work as a killer for some shadowy society called the Organization. The things he said he had to do were awful, inhuman. Just from reading his words, I could feel his pain as though it was my own. He said that the organization was nightmarishly strict, and that it was only thanks to his partner that he was able to send me letters in the first place. My brother wrote a lot about his partner, describing him as a true friend, almost like a younger brother. This was the only topic where I saw his writing soften, where he seemed happy. Naturally, I found myself wanting to meet this person, but that was impossible, and I knew it. I couldn't even meet my own sibling, let alone his partner in some secret assassin deal. Or secret assassin cabal. We continued exchanging letters like this for some time, but even that came to an end. The household ran out of mira again, and I knew what was coming. I could tell it would soon be my turn to leave. I wrote my brother, telling him as much. He wrote back telling me that he and his partner had decided to escape the organization. I could sense from his words just how resolved he was to do it. He followed his declaration with a promise to come for me, to get me out of that hellhole of a home. What followed, however, at the very end of his letter, was a grim note. If this escape somehow ends in failure, I'm going to prioritize my partner's life over my own. If it comes down to it, I'll sacrifice everything to make sure he at least gets out of here. You can trust him. If anything happens, you can rely on him to help. That was the last letter I ever received from him. In the end, he never came back for me, and Dad kicked me out. Just as I thought he would. He had become a slovenly mess. From the look of it, he had got himself addicted to some especially nasty substances, the kind that tend to quickly drain one's finances. I knew they were destroying him physically as well, but I had stopped caring long ago. I was done with that disgusting scumbag I once called my dad. I used an intermediary to secure an opportunity to join the organization. It was right as I was entering training that I learned of my brother's death. I was told he was killed by his own partner. It was then my world began to fall apart. I threw myself headlong into my training, not thinking of anything else. I was distraught and trying to escape reality however I could. I ignored everyone around me, and even myself. I let my soul slip into hibernation and fully assumed the role of one of the organization's tools. During the day, I would follow orders, not thinking for myself. But then night would come, and I'd have nothing to distract me. My mind would be tormented by the thoughts of my brother's passing. The realization that I was now truly alone in the world shook me, as did the notion that my hands would soon be irreversibly stained with blood. Once the fear set in, there was no escaping it, and I gradually lost the ability to sleep properly. The body does have a limit, of course, and I'd eventually fall unconscious for about an hour or two, or an hour a night. Two, if I was really lucky. But it wasn't sleep, not really. It was far too shallow for me to physically or mentally recover much, and what little rest I did get was plagued with nightmares. Even after I had woken up, those bizarre, horrid sensations remained. A year passed like this, with no improvement whatsoever. Despite that, I was able to graduate from the factory at an exceptionally fast pace. That was when I finally had a chance to meet him, the boy who had fought alongside my brother as his partner. He had just finished his own re-education, a consequence of betraying the organization. As fate would have it, we were assigned as partners. He was the one who had stolen my brother from me, so I was resolved to despise him from the moment we met. I quietly kept a close eye on him, observing each and every one of his movements. Before long, though, something unexpected happened. Perhaps all of my pent-up fear and exhaustion had finally boiled over. Perhaps it was just my instincts, telling me the truth that I had been ignoring. Whatever the reason, one day, we were out on a mission, and I found myself able to sleep when I was next to him. I mean, actually sleep. Deeply and soundly, for the first time in an entire year. There was something about his presence that gave me a sense of security. It wasn't unlike how I remembered feeling being next to my brother, strangely enough. When I woke up from this much-needed rest, so many things came rushing back. Suddenly, without warning, I found myself bawling, and as those tears came pouring out, the chains that had sealed away my heart slowly began to loosen. I started feeling human again. I could feel my emotions for the first time in what felt like an eternity. As soon as he saw me crying, the boy quickly came over to console me, but that just made me sob harder. I quickly discovered my new partner really was the person my brother wrote so fondly about. Blunt and a little awkward, but overall a deeply kind person and a very thoughtful partner. Despite being shackled to the organization and forced to kill for years, he had yet to fully surrender his humanity. He did seem to be bearing a great sorrow, one far more intense than anything my brother had described. I could tell he wasn't the kind of person capable of betraying and murdering a friend to ensure his own survival. Given my brother's letter, it wasn't hard to work out what had really happened. After making their escape, the two were backed into a corner, and their prospects were grim. Rather than both of them being killed, it was better that at least one of them survived. The only way for that to happen was for one to kill the other, to gain forgiveness in the eyes of the organization. My brother knew his partner would reject the idea outright, and that even if he did accept it, he would insist on playing the part of the sacrifice. I was absolutely sure of that much. That's why my brother ended up feigning betrayal in order to get his partner to fight back and ultimately kill him. It was a plan that would spare his partner's life, but also deeply scar him in the only way an unexpected betrayal could. From that point on, being near him was the only way I was able to feel secure enough to sleep, and sleep I did, every chance I got. Midday, during our missions, if there was even the slightest opportunity, I was out like a light. After all, I needed to catch up on the year of rest I had been robbed of. It was truly a surprising turn of events for me, to say the least. I soon learned the boy was tormented by constant nightmares. I imagine the incident with my brother played a big role. There were so many moments where I saw how he was suffering and wanted to tell him the truth, but I would always stop myself at the last second, telling myself the time wasn't right. Our missions occasionally called for performances of a sort to deceive onlookers. He was always pretty terrible at it. It was hard to say why exactly that was, though. His movements were fine enough, as were his facial expressions. The factory emphasized all those things in its teachings, so he had received some He had received ample instruction there. It was just that he always seemed to overdo things, or drastically underdo them. I wondered if it may have been something to do with the unshakable seriousness he always seemed to have about him. It could be a real problem sometimes, even to the point where he would become more of a liability than an asset. Any onlooker with half a brain would be able to tell something was less than genuine about his performances. I came to the conclusion he was just naturally bad at deceiving others. That's why I had to keep my plans from him, to prevent his terrible poker face from giving us away. He had been earnestly working on his escape for a very long time. I, of course, understood the immense difficulty of his task, and why he had kept it to himself. Still, it may be a bit sad that he never spoke to me about it. He was in a precarious position, given the organization still had its doubts about him. But I wasn't about to do anything to put him at risk, of course. But his shaky acting alone could very well have led to the organization seeing through his carefully laid scheme. If that happened, it would be the end of him, no question about it. The situation hadn't quite reached that point yet, but I knew it was only a matter of time before it did. After the Haldor Barn mission wrapped up, I went to make my report. The man I reported to had an aura unlike anything I'd ever felt. He was the evil bastard who managed the two of us, the organization's overseer, the Emperor. He was the one forcing us to kill. His face was always obscured by a robe, but it failed to mask the malice that overflowed from him. That day, he had a quiet, deadly exuberance about him, like a hawk that had locked onto its prey. There was no mistaking it. I knew he had caught onto my partner. He knew he intended to betray the organization again. I knew he would gleefully purge him when the time came, and that time was getting closer with each passing day. If that's how things were going to be, I told myself, I would just have to get ahead of him and put my own plan to motion. The Emperor's intentions were obvious. Aware of the cruel history my partner and I shared, he had made us partners in a bid to slowly push me towards revenge. He knew I'd eventually break and sell my partner out, forcing him to go through another bitter betrayal. The Emperor was looking forward to watching it all unfold. We were both tools of the organization and the personal playthings of the Emperor's. So, I decided to give him exactly what he wanted to see. Once I'd finished my mission report, I told the Emperor my partner's intent to betray the organization. I then shared my plan to lure him to a specific place, where I would then eliminate him. I gave a detailed explanation, making it as enticing as possible for the Emperor. It was easy enough to gain his consent, even with his face hidden under his cowl. He could hardly contain the excitement in his voice over the coming slaughter. The laugh that escaped his throat was a sound so vile it still haunts me to this day. Later that evening, my partner arrived at the designated location, the base of a hill deep in the mountains. At first, he was horribly shaken by the realization that he had been betrayed again. When he learned who my brother was, though, his face changed. I watched his surprise turn into despair, which in turn shifted to absolute acceptance of his fate. To call what I saw heart-wrenching didn't do it justice. I focused my efforts on giving him the most vicious glare possible, one equal parts mocking and murderous. I came up with the foulest, most malicious thing I could bear to say, trying to cut him as deep as possible. After all, the Emperor was standing right next to me, and if I was to be convincing, I couldn't afford even the slightest hesitation. I stepped forward. I was going to eliminate him. I shifted closer to my partner in order to facilitate my wire attacks. Or so I made it appear. My true objective was to put some distance between myself and the Emperor. Once I had my wires around his neck, the battle was as good as over. From there, I knew I could end his life with the flick of a finger. This is the end. I meant those words from the bottom of my heart. A transparent cord ran through the center of the web of wires under my control. Manipulating this cord allowed me to set off a chain reaction that twisted it into a complex spiral shape I would often use to trap distant foes during missions. Fully focused on watching his toys in the throes of bloodthirsty vengeance, it was the Emperor who had relaxed his guard the most. Right at the climax of our battle, I seized the opportunity, and with perfect timing, I was able to ensnare the unwitting Emperor, leaving him shackled and immobile. The key was a transparent cord. It may not have had the same cutting power as my metal wires, but it was more than twice as strong. Even so, I couldn't count on it to hold the Emperor for long. Without a moment's delay, I summoned all my strength to pull on another cord. A low rumble sounded out, and a section of the rocky hill collapsed, dropping a torrent of rubble below. I had taken my time to find the perfect location, one with brittle bedrock that I could have break away on cue. The stones roared and tumbled in a huge wave, hurtling down toward the Emperor. In the middle of it all was a giant boulder more than 10 arcs across. Time seemed to slow as I fell directly down at the Emperor's head, the thunder of the rock slide drowning out all other sound. Finally, it all came crashing down. The aftermath looked as though a catastrophic earthquake had just taken place. The Emperor had taken a direct hit from a massive boulder. There was no way he could have survived that. Even if he somehow had, he was not buried alive. My partner looked on in confusion, still processing what had just happened. "S!" I cried out, finally able to use the name I preferred to call him by. I ran over to him and buried my head in his chest. This was where I felt the most safe, by his side. I nuzzled up against him, holding him tight, never wanting to let him go. I had never hugged him before then. I'd always been too afraid to do so. "I'm so sorry I said those horrible things," I sobbed. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you the truth." There was so much more to explain, but those were the things I wanted to say to him the most. Even though he was still reeling from everything that had just happened, he was still kind enough to hold me close and try to calm me down. 9. What in the world? Before he could finish his sentence, something I never predicted happened. The small mountain of fallen rocks and boulders shifted slightly. Pebbles began to ride up into the air. It was slow, but unmistakable. "What's happening?" Dumbfounded, all we could do was look on in confusion. Is this some kind of space element art? There's no way," I mused aloud. No, that didn't seem right. Perhaps it was some kind of device that functioned the same way an airship's anti-gravity components? I didn't understand what was happening. I just sat there, staring blankly, my mind racing for an explanation. Before I could reach one, however, my partner spoke, his voice steeped in panic. "That's the Emperor's power!" "But that would mean..." It meant the Emperor was still alive. More and more rocks began floating upward, taking their place among the ever-increasing collection gently balanced in the air. Nine, we need to move." I continued to sit there, absolutely dumbfounded. 3 grabbed my hand, and we set off at a sprint. We were able to cover a good amount of distance before we heard what sounded like a massive explosion behind us. We turned to see boulders and rocks of all sizes being flung upward into the sky, like a volcano erupting before our eyes. Chapter 7. Tears and Promises. 3 and 9 ducked into a mountain cave on the outskirts of Luzent. They had fled from the Emperor as fast as their legs could carry them, and were now completely out of breath. As they sat there together, 9 told 3 everything she had kept from him up until then. She told him about Ace, about herself, the details of her plan, and finally, what really happened in that cave 3 years ago. At the start, 3 occasionally chimed in or asked questions, but as the conversation went on, he fell silent. By the end, his head was hung so low that 9 couldn't see his expression. He had been utterly convinced that his friend, his one true friend, had betrayed him, when in reality, Ace had sacrificed his life to ensure 3 would survive. And as thanks for that incredibly selfless act, 3 had not only killed him, but had spent the past 3 years despising his memory. Then came his sister, risking her life to save her brother's killer. 3 felt his chest tighten up as a wild mix of emotions ran through his head, threatening to overpower him. He was grateful for being fortunate enough to have 2 people in his life, Ace and 9, who he could fully trust. At the same time, he felt a bottomless well of anger burst up, anger at himself, the pathetic excuse for a human being that he was. Battered by a storm of emotions, his breathing became increasingly ragged. "Es, are you crying?" Nine looked on in concern. Having finished her story, she didn't need a response, however. Three's pained silence spoke volumes. "I'm fine," he said, returning to his usual blunt tone. "Is there anything I can do to make you feel better?" Nine asked. "I said I'm fine." Despite his words, Three's head still hung low. "You're an awful actor, but you're an even worse liar when you're not performing, you know that?" Three sunk down to his knees. Nine moved over to him, taking his head in her hands. She began gently ruffling his hair, like a mother comforting a child. "Everything's okay now," she murmured gently. "It's all okay." "But I... Three stammered, his voice growing weak and hoarse. The last bit of Three's facade broke down, overwhelmed by Nine's kindness, and he relented at last. Nine was younger than Three, and definitely looked the part, but in that moment, she showed an almost motherly love of understanding and compassion. For someone like Three, who grew up without that warmth, it was his first time being comforted by someone, his first time feeling the warmth of family. "I know how strong you've had to be, yes. I know how hard it's been, for so long. But it's okay now, I promise." No longer able to hold his emotions back, he finally broke down. A lifetime's worth of tears came flooding out of his eyes, all at once. I'm such a wretched excuse for her," he sobbed, no longer able to control his voice in the slightest. Hot tears poured down his cheeks, staining the cool floor of the cave. "That's not true. You know that's not true," Nine said, softly, continuing to run her fingers through his hair. "Why am I still alive? Why isn't Ace here instead?" He weakly slammed his fist against the ground in frustration. "Not another word of that. I won't hear it. You're the one who's been there for me the past few years. You, S. But it's because of me that Ace..." "Listen, that just means you need to fight twice as hard. You're living for him, too. You're living for him, too, now." Three's words failed him as he was overtaken by sobbing. His years of pain and suffering poured out of him. After some time, Three was able to calm himself down and somewhat and regain his composure. "I'm here for you, so you don't have to cry," Nine told him. "But if you ever want to, then that's okay too." "So which is it then?" Three retorted, his detached demeanor creeping back. He suddenly became aware of the fact that he was in her arms and hurriedly pulled away. He immediately turned the conversation back toward exchanging information in an attempt to mask his sudden embarrassment. They finished catching up and turned their attention to their current predicament. "So, the Overseer had me figured out. He knew I was going to try and make a run for it, and that's why you moved to strike first, in order to outmaneuver him," Three thought out loud. "That's right. I've been watching the whole time, waiting for the perfect opportunity to take him down." "I wish you'd told me beforehand." "And let you spoil the element of surprise with your awful acting skills?" Nine gave a wry grin. "Yeah, I don't think so." Three's face scrunched up a bit. Both Nine and the Emperor had caught on to his plan, so there was little room to defend him in that regard. "I chose the moment he'd be the most distracted," Nine continued, switching to a serious expression. "My timing was perfect, and my preparations were more than enough. Yet, despite all that, despite everything, despite being buried under a pile of massive boulders, the Emperor was still very much alive. No matter how much she thought, Nine simply couldn't figure out how it was possible." "It's likely his power at work," Three said. He had said the same thing earlier, right as they took off running. "What exactly is his power?" Nine asked. "I'm fairly certain he can control gravity somehow," Three said. "He did something similar 3 years ago, when Ace and I fought him." Three wrenched open a bitter, painful memory and began relaying what he remembered to Nine. He and Ace had been able to fend off the first 2 pairs of assailants sent after them by the organization. It was then they faced the Emperor, however. Even with the element of surprise on their side, even when they coordinated their attacks perfectly, facing him proved to be exceptionally difficult. They found their bodies heavy and clumsy, and their movements lacking precision and skill. The Emperor, on the other hand, was as nimble as could be, almost inhumanly so, the two were quickly overpowered. So, what do you think? 3 looked at 9, awaiting her input. There was no sign of him starting any cast or charge up, so I doubt he's using arts, she said. Her brow furrowed in thought. As for a portable gravity manipulation device small enough to carry for a single person to carry and conceal, well, given modern technology, it's seriously hard to imagine. He might have an artifact or something like it. An avalanche couldn't kill him, and he has enough precise control to be able to move individual stones and boulders. 9 scratched her head in frustration. Damn it! We really don't have a lot to go on here. She paused, thinking a moment more, and then continued. In any case, unless something major changes, he's too powerful for us. Any attempt at a direct attack is going to result in our deaths. They fell silent for a time, until 3 spoke up, a grave expression on his face. If the time comes when we have to choose, we're going to prioritize your life, 9. You need to be the one to... Stop it! 9 silenced 3 with an outburst of pure emotion, far more raw than her usual self. But then you'd at least be able to... If you die, I'm going right after you, she shouted. I'll do it myself if I have to. The calm motherly figure from before was nowhere to be seen. 9 was in a frenzy now, almost like a child throwing a tantrum. Regardless of her tone, however, her words were heartfelt and earnest. I can't go back to not being able to sleep. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I can't go back to being alone. The weight of her feelings was clear to 3. Seeing this, he let out a short sigh. Then you have my word. No matter what happens, I'll protect you. That's not what I'm asking for. Okay, you're right, 3 said, taking a deep breath. Then I promise we'll survive this. We'll get through it together. 9 looked at 3 with imploring, almost pleading eyes. You swear? I swear, he said. Now, if we're going to have any chance at all, we'll need to do everything perfectly. The rock slide was mass enough that despite the fact that they survived it, it was hard to imagine that the Emperor was completely unscathed. If they tried to flee now, the organization would quickly find them again, and they would have to contend with the Emperor at his full strength. The pair knew if they were going to make a move, now was the time. Let's do it then. We'll take him out. Chapter 8. Gravity and Artifacts. 3 and 9 returned to the hill, or, more accurately, where the hill used to be. It was now completely unrecognizable. A sizable chunk of it was gone, having been strewn about the area in the form of countless bits of rubble. The Emperor stood right where they left him, seemingly unfazed. As 3 and 9 had surmised, he had sustained at least some manner of injury. Nothing major, but his ever-present robe, under which he had hidden his face, had now been reduced to little more than a shredded cape. Underneath, he wore a golden helmet bearing a crown design. In his hand, he carried a golden scepter with a spherical tip, and his body was covered in golden armor. The word ostentatious was insufficient to describe his heavily gilded countenance. Everything about him suggested both needless grandeur and wicked condescension. I knew you'd be back. You two aren't complete fools after all, the Emperor called out to them. 3 and 9 remained silent as they slowly approached. So, have you decided which of you two will gain the organization's forgiveness? 3 and 9 turned toward each other and nodded. 3 removed his hand from his sword, leaving it unsheathed. 3 knelt down and closed his eyes, showing acceptance of what was to come. In response, 9 pulled out some of her poison needles and silently launched them at 3's neck, or at least that's how she made it appear. At the last second before the needles parted from her fingers, she deftly altered their trajectory, sending them speeding toward the Emperor instead. The envenomed projectiles whizzed perfectly through the air as ever. However, as they neared their intended target, they suddenly curved downward sharply, plummeting harmlessly to the ground. Very well. I hear your answer loud and clear, the Emperor proclaimed, looking up at the pair. You both wish to die today. Not a chance. Not a chance, 9 called out, throwing another volley of needles directly at the Emperor. The trajectory suddenly shifted again, this time upward. From his kneeling position, 3 quickly shifted his stance and pushed forward off the ground with all the power he could muster in his legs. He launched himself at the Emperor, breaking into a full-on charge. "We've had enough. You're the one meeting their death today." 3 began slashing away at his target with incredible speed. His lightning-quick strikes grew slow and sluggish as soon as they neared the Emperor, however. With his assailant's speed so drastically curbed, the man was able to use his golden scepter to effortlessly bat aside the boy's assault. In the same instant, 9's second set of needles changed direction midair and began falling straight toward the Emperor. She had managed to calculate the range of his gravitational field with just a single throw. Once she understood its effect on projectiles, she was able to revise her trajectory. Moreover, she had factored in the increased acceleration from the higher gravity, meaning her needles would hit harder than normal. Despite all that, however, her attack was neutralized by a flick of the Emperor's gilded arm. It was still not enough to penetrate his armor. It was, however, more than sufficient to rouse his ire. "You dare defy me? Me?" Livid, he swung his scepter downward. 3 immediately reacted, just barely managing to block the attack with his sword. Even so, the impact alone threw him back several arge. Livid, he swung his scepter downward. 3 immediately reacted, just barely managing to block the attack with his sword. Even so, the impact alone threw him back several arge. 3 could feel his brain rattle in his skull from the force of the blow. There was no way the Emperor's physical strength and the weight of the scepter alone could do that. It occurred to 3 that there must have been some other way he was able to manipulate gravity. "You will be purged," the Emperor said in a low growl. The same words 3 had heard him say a few hours ago and 3 years ago. When the Emperor spoke like this, it was nothing less than the arbitration of a death sentence. At the sound of those words, past memories bubbled up in 3's mind and an old terror began to grip him. His legs grew wobbly, and he started to stagger. One glance back at 9 was all it took for him to restore his resolve, however. He forced himself back on his feet, reflexively snapping into a fighting stance. 9 continued to provide covering fire with her needles as 3 renewed his assault. Their approach proved no more fruitful than before. Even so, as 3 continued to fight under such grueling conditions, he slowly became more capable. His understanding of his foe's gravitational trickery improved, and his strikes grew more swift and precise as a result. The way his muscles intuitively reacted, the angle and speed at which he swung his swords, he was slowly chipping away at the Emperor's overwhelming advantage. Though 3 may not have enjoyed the same powers of insight his partner possessed, his skills in close quarters combat were elite by even the most exacting of standards. For her part, 9's cover was solid and unwavering. Realizing her needles had no hope of piercing the Emperor's golden plating, she instead began aiming for gaps between its pieces. It was an incredibly difficult task, but as she grew more accustomed to the disrupting effects of the gravitational field, she was gradually getting closer. She began weaving in offensive arts along with her volleys of needles in order to keep the Emperor on his toes. Her attacks appeared simple enough for her foe to deal with, but they still managed to pull his attention away from 3, even if only for a moment. The fight raged on, and after a bit of time, 3 and 9 appeared to have finally begun gaining the upper hand. Yet, the Emperor did not seem fazed in the slightest. His expression was unreadable beneath the shadows of his helmet, but it was clear from his body language he still believed himself fully in control of the situation. 3 managed to land the occasional strike, but even his sword seemed to do little against the Emperor's impossibly resilient armor. In an attempt to land a heavier blow, 3 launched himself into the air, intending to let gravity carry his swords downwards, just as 9's needles had. However, he found himself soaring up higher than he had intended, impossibly so, as though he had suddenly sprouted wings. His mark completely missed. He lost his sense of balance and began tumbling through the air. He quickly realized it could have only been due to more of his foe's trickery. Reduced gravity? Expertly seizing the opening, the Emperor raised his scepter overhead and as swiftly swung it downward. As if mimicking this motion, 3 suddenly dropped out of the air, thrown to the ground below like a rag doll. Gah! The air knocked out of his lungs, 3 struggled to catch his breath, spitting up mouthfuls of blood in between gasps. Get out of the way! He's not done! Saved by 9's frantic warning, 3 just barely managed to roll out of the way. A split second later, the scepter slammed down into the ground where he had just been. As the gravity-enhanced scepter connected with the rocky ground below, it let out a powerful blast, leaving a crater in its wake. S! The resulting shockwave launched 3 to the side, knocking him to relative safety. Had he taken a direct hit, he would have been completely pulverized. Though dazed, he was still aware enough to signal to 9 that he was okay. He forced himself to his feet. The battle had completely changed. The Emperor had begun manipulating gravity levels on a constant cycle, and 3 was forced into a defensive position. Whenever he managed to get a handle on his foe's barrage of attacks, he found the gravity level altered yet again, forcing him to start back at 0. It was impossible for him to fight in such ever-changing conditions. The situation was taxing for 9 as well. She found herself forced to constantly recalculate the field's range and gravity value, severely reducing the number of effective attacks she was able to launch. Despite their bleak outlook, the 2 of them continued to hold out. Even when pressured, 3 served as an excellent vanguard, consistently denying the Emperor any opportunities for a decisive strike. 9, meanwhile, continued to back him up flawlessly, acting with a surgical precision that ensured no opening went to waste. S! She called out to him as he leapt back, putting some distance between himself and the Emperor. I think I figured something out. Let's hear it. Let's hear it. 3 waited for her to continue, keeping his guard up and watching closely for any sign of attack from the Emperor. Have you noticed anything different from when you and Ace fought him before? Was he carrying anything in his left hand back then? 3 glanced back at his foe's left hand, seeing it empty. He thought back to 3 years ago. Now that you mention it, I'm pretty sure he had an orb with him, purple, with a golden sculpture of a crow on it. The battle back then was completely one-sided. Just as I suspected, 9 nodded. 3 had also sensed something was different, but had simply chalked it up to the Emperor toying with them, as he didn't consider them to be a true threat to him. Factoring what 9 just pointed out, however, cast things in a much different light. Oh, so you realized. The Emperor paused his onslaught, as though in recognition of 9's keen observation. You see the implements he has on him now? I suspect at one point he had 4 different artifacts that let him control gravity. 4, huh? 3 said, taking note of the Emperor's equipment. Right, a helmet with a crown motif that can increase or reduce the overall level of gravity, armor that absorbs the force imparted by attacks the moment they're received, a scepter that sends out a devastating gravitational wave when it makes contact with its target, and an orb with a crow perched on it that allows its wielder to alter gravity on a target-by-target basis. 9 paused her explanation for a moment as she looked defiantly at the Emperor. The reason he had worn that tattered cloak was now clear. If someone were to wield so many artifacts as he did, it would be necessary to conceal them. Failure to do so would surely draw unwanted attention from the church. Now that you mention it, this time around he hasn't been moving faster, while slowing us down at the same time, 3 said. When we fought him before, we couldn't even touch him. It was true that in their fight against him, 3 and Ace had been struggling under different levels of gravity than the Emperor. There was no doubt he was toying with them in the present, but at the very least both sides were battling under the same levels of gravity, constantly shifting though they were. As such, the pair's odds of winning were much better this time around. I think he either lost the orb at some point or it was destroyed, or at least damaged in the rock slide, 9 explained. The pair realized that if this was true, now was their best chance to take down the Emperor once and for all. A talented tool indeed. The Emperor's voice was low, tinged with a hint of perverse delight. The artifacts I wear are collectively known as the Monarch's Regalia. I'm impressed you were able to analyze their capabilities in such a limited amount of time. You, 9 of Swords, are truly outstanding. I don't want your praise, you bastard. Ignoring 9's retort, the Emperor continued on, his exhilaration giving way to a violent savagery. But even the greatest tool is worthless if it will not submit to its rightful place in my hands. His body began levitating, broken chunks of earth underfoot rising upward with him. With all the force he could muster, he swung his scepter into a nearby boulder. and worthless tools must be disposed of. In that instant, the boulder shattered into shards of all shapes and sizes that were sent rocketing toward 9. "Watch out!" 3 cried out. The shards flew like a salvo of bullets from 1,000 guns. All of them pointed directly at one target. It was a grim sight, not unlike a single soldier standing before the assault of an entire army. Panicked, 3 rushed into the line of fire. He brandished his sword and did everything he could to prevent the shards from reaching 9. He deflected and broke what he could, using his body as a shield for the rest. But there was a considerable distance between him and 9, one he could not easily cover. By the time he had leapt in the way, a great many shards were already too far ahead. 3 was too late. 9 had no realistic chance of avoiding the entirety of the attack, instead devoted her efforts to simply avoiding the worst of the pieces of stone flying at her. There were far too many, however, and one managed to slip through her defenses. She suffered a direct hit to the abdomen, and a red mist sprayed from her mouth as she crumpled to the earth. Chapter 9. Anger and Analysis. 9! 3 ran over to her, his voice hoarse with agony and grief. Her forehead, hands, legs, her entire body was stained with blood, dripping from 1,000 scratches and cuts. It was a fate far too cruel for such a young girl. No matter how many times 3 called out to her, she didn't respond. He had sworn to protect her. He had promised her. But now, 3 felt himself overcome by shame and regret. "I'm too weak," he thought to himself. "Too weak to help anyone. Too weak to save anyone." As if to seize upon his distress, the Emperor spoke once more. "So one of you end up making it. If you're smart, you'll stop here. Deliver the final blow, and your life will be spared, just as before." At those words, 3 felt a creaking in his mind. It was harsh, like the sound of metal scraping against metal. "I imagine she takes some sick satisfaction in being killed by the same person who killed her brother anyway." The Emperor's mouth twisted into a perverse smile. The depravity in his eyes clear, even through the shadow cast by his helmet. It was then something snapped inside of 3. "Ah, die!" He exploded as if the boundless rage coursing through his veins had at last found an outlet. His legs and arms snapped into operation. A primal rumble burst from his throat. His bones creaked, and his blood boiled. Pure fury ignited his entire body, inciting it to action, and before he knew it, he had launched himself at the Emperor. He unleashed a whirlwind of attacks, his strikes faster and more powerful than ever before. The Emperor met the charge head-on, altering gravity as he went, but 3 adapted to each shift almost as fast as they came. His body was running on pure instinct, sharpening his senses to a razor-sharp edge and giving him almost preternatural adaptability. The Emperor, on the other hand, found himself working harder and harder to handle 3's hail of blows. He managed to block the oncoming strikes, but his attacker showed no sign of slowing down. "Like a wild dog," the Emperor sneered. "A tool with a will of its own is a useless thing, to be sure, but seeing you foaming at the mouth like this is pathetic beyond measure. You truly are fated to die as you lived, a mere thing." Even in the face of 3's enraged onslaught, the Emperor had hardly taken any damage at all. He still held all the cards. 3 was little more than an annoyance, like a flea biting a wolf. 3's thoughts bubbled back up to the surface. He found himself remembering something 9 had said. It was his natural sense of composure that allowed him to recall such a timely memory, composure he did not possess 3 years ago. He continued to let his anger drive his body, but maintained a calm mind, not allowing his thoughts to slip away in rage. He could have stopped himself at any time, but found his current rage beneficial, and wielded it ably, as though it was simply another weapon available to him. 3 himself was unaware of this, but such an ability to not only control one's emotions, but turn them into power was rare indeed. It was a skill that did not come easily to even the greatest warriors, yet 3 had managed to master such a complicated concept at his young age. Armor that absorbs the force imparted by attacks the moment they are received. That was how 9 described the Emperor's armor. Sure enough, just as he described, no matter how many strikes 3 launched, nothing seemed to get through. It was then that realization dawned on him. If the armor was immune to external force, then what he needed to do was induce an internal force. Anyone else may have given up at this point, but 3 could scarcely imagine a more suitable target for his unique skills. He combined his blades into one, squaring off against the Emperor yet again. The defining characteristic of 3's weapons was their ability to internally induce an arts-based explosion in their range. To do so, he needed to strike the same point with each blade separately, and then a third time in their fused form. By this point, he had already landed a number of hits on the Emperor's armor, and luckily for 3, a decent amount of those hits overlapped. All that remained was the final step in the process, making contact with those intersecting points using his fused sword. 3 attacked the Emperor with the same range and power as before. This time, though, he failed to land a single hit. He was just a hair's breadth off every single time. The first steps in his weapons process was relatively simple. He simply needed to land a strike with each weapon, creating 2 perpendicular lines that would paint a target for the orbit. The next part, however, was far more difficult. He needed to use the fused blade to hit the precise point where the 2 lines intersected. This was a much smaller target area, making the task that much more demanding. Still, 3 was confident in his aim and knew he had the dexterity to pull it off. In spite of his skill and confidence, however, he continually found himself failing to land a decisive hit. The Emperor cackled in delight as he watched 3 struggle. To him, 3's plights were nothing short of pure comedy. "I know my tools inside and out," he said, a dark grin spreading across his face. "Your methods of attack, how your weapons work, I understand these things even better than you." As if proving the Emperor's point, 3's next attack fell short as well. The Emperor launched a counterattack with his staff swung at the perfect angle. 3 had figured out his foe's tricks. Right before each of his attacks would land, the Emperor would make a subtle change to the gravity. His timing was exquisite, and the trick was executed in such a way that 3 had no time to correct the angle of the sword. Further, the gravity wave emitted by the Emperor's scepter did nothing at all when it failed to connect. But if it did, the resulting damage would be enormous. Thus far, 3 had been able to evade or turn away each incoming swing, but he knew it was only because the Emperor was allowing it. He had yet to land a single effective attack, and the wear on both his weapon and his own body was steadily mounting. The outcome of the battle seemed clear, and by all appearances there was nothing that could change its course. Thanks to his impeccable defense, 3 was barely holding on, looking more and more like he could collapse at any moment. In between clashes, a momentary calm settled over the battlefield. As 3 was weighing his option, a voice broke the silence. It was a lazy drawl, one that 3 had heard many times over the past year. Analysis complete. 9 struggled to her feet, looking as though she could fall back down at any moment. "How?" The Emperor's genuine shock escaped his mouth in a low hiss. "9, you're okay!" 3 exclaimed. At once he understood what had happened. 9 hadn't fallen unconscious. She had simply feigned doing so in order to analyze the Emperor in secret. She had given 3 no indication of her plan whatsoever. After all, had she done so, the Emperor may very well have caught on to her plan. "Just fine," she responded. "I used my wires to cushion the blow of the boulders by shredding them into smaller pieces. In the end, the rocks barely scratched me." Judging by the amount of blood that covered her, it would have been clear to anyone this was far from the truth, but the fact remained that she was both alive and conscious. 3 disengaged from the Emperor and moved closer to 9, making sure to keep his eyes trained on his foe as he did so. "There's a moment where he's unable to respond to anything," she explained. "That's his power's fatal weakness." "What do you mean?" "His gravitational manipulation doesn't require casting like an art would. But after he uses it, there's a period of time of about a second before he's able to use it again. That's why he wasn't able to immediately prevent the falling rocks from burying him earlier." "But the way he's changing gravity is so precise," 3 said, thinking back on their battle. "How could he have managed that?" "He was just reading your movement, S. He knows how you fight like the back of his hand." "Wait, what?" 3 exclaimed, the surprise in his voice clear. "It's true," 9 responded. The way he manipulates gravity is determined before you even start your swings. He knows your tendencies well, and uses that knowledge to predict your actions. Is that even possible? Asked 3, his mind racing. It is, unfortunately, 9 responded, and he's not using an artifact for it either. His mind just works that quickly. He's a monster through and through. The Emperor let out a low cackle. A sound analysis, but it will avail you nothing. I know your techniques inside and out. The same speed, the same power, the same angles, each and every time. There's no way you can possibly undo years of the habits we so painstakingly drilled into you. S. 9 looked up at him, knowingly. Right, he responded. Let's end this. The duo nodded in agreement and turned to face the Emperor once more. 3 charged at him again, renewing his previous assault. He raised his sword overhead, attacking at a high angle. The Emperor dodged it effortlessly and sent forth a counterattack. Their deadly dance continued as before, but as things were, both sides knew where it would ultimately lead. The Emperor sensed an incoming attack and prepared to manipulate gravity. Just as he predicted, 3 attacked a half-step faster, aiming for one of the spots in his armor that had been previously marked. And as the sword raced towards its target, gravity shifted and the sword's trajectory was altered. Despite this, it somehow continued on its original path regardless, as if the altered gravity had been predicted and compensated for. Impossible! The Emperor muttered under his breath. He hastily jerked his body out of the blade's trajectory, with hardly a second to spare. 3's movements had changed, somehow, as the Emperor mulled the changing situation over. 3's next attack came speeding in. The Emperor again predicted the speed and trajectory, and manipulated gravity accordingly. However, a muffled explosion rang out, and the Emperor felt his armor crack and pain course through his left arm. Boom! What? Another flash. Boom. His right leg was now damaged as well. The Emperor was at an utter loss. Had 3 managed to correctly predict his spatial manipulation? How was he suddenly able to alter his strikes to compensate for gravity? Had the analyzer been analyzed himself? Cursing 3's name, the Emperor's thoughts grew frantic. As he desperately looked around for a clue, he realized what was actually happening. He glimpsed a number of barely visible cords extending from 3's body. Naturally, 9 stood on the other end, controlling them. She wasn't pulling him to and fro like a marionette, but was instead nudging his attack slightly, guiding his direction, timing and angle to create the perfect strike. The Emperor may have been predicting 3's attacks and making adjustments, but 9 was doing the same in turn to him in turn. It was her guidance that allowed 3 to score direct hit after direct hit. Her superior intellect was, of course, a major reason this was possible, but her relationship with 3 was their true secret weapon. The 2 knew each other better than anyone in the world, which allowed her to predict his reactions and movements with incredible accuracy. She used her natural understanding of her partner to help him adapt his combat style to fit the situation at hand. In that sense, the secret behind the upper hand they had suddenly gained was as simple as could be. You little bitch! The Emperor let out an enraged growl, laced with bitter hatred. Neither 3 nor 9 had ever seen him like this before. He tried to launch the same rocky onslaught at 9 that he had before, but found himself bereft of munitions. He could not be sure when it happened, but at some point, the duo had led him to a different part of the area, one where he could no longer weaponize the terrain. With furious bloodlust, he lowered the gravity near him and rushed at 9. Finally, she smirked. I've been waiting. A giant boulder appeared in the air above the Emperor, likely due to an art 9 had cast. The Emperor was unimpressed, however, at being subjected to the same attack twice. This time around, it even lacked the element of surprise. He easily shattered the incoming boulder with his staff once it entered his area of reduced gravity. But it was a flippant display of arrogance that sealed his fate. As the pieces of the boulder rained down around him, he found himself face to face with a plush toy rabbit, one that had been hidden within the boulder. No! He exclaimed, knowing full well it was no mere toy. His realization came too late, however. With a massive bang, the rabbit detonated. Light and heat washed over the Emperor, and his legs buckled under the force. Just then, another explosion went off at his back. 3 had landed a solid hit on his chest armor, and the resulting blast had blown it clear off his body. This is the end, 3 said quietly. The black-hearted Emperor's armor had been destroyed, and Three's blade had found its bloody mark. Chapter 10. S and N. The Emperor had fallen to his knees, Three's sword protruding from his chest. He looked up at the sky and gave a dry, bitter laugh. "Found some humor in your end, have you?" asked Three. "To think you two would best me," the Emperor said, his voice weak. "I admit it. I underestimated you. You are, by far, the most powerful tools I've ever had the pleasure of owning." "Enough. We're not your tools any longer," Three said, gripping his sword, preparing himself to silence the Emperor forever. So he thought to himself, the moment to kill had come yet again, the thing he hated most, the thing he would never grow accustomed to. Things were different this time, given the man who stole away his humanity in the first place now sat at the end of his sword, but that didn't stop Three's hand from trembling. "S," Nine said gently, moving closer. "We'll do it together, okay?" Her typically light and relaxed expression was now serious and sincere. "Okay," Three responded. This was it, the moment where the two would put their tragic past to rest. Nine placed her hands on Three's, steadying his weapon. Her warmth abated his trembling ever so slightly. They moved to raise the sword together. In response, the Emperor spoke once more. "Every arch of your path thus far has been stained with blood, just as the rest of your lives shall be. Your fates are immutable. Kill or be killed, control or be controlled. You will end up no different than I. We will ever be one and the same." "You're wrong," said Nine. "We're no longer anyone's tools, and we'll never force anyone to be ours." "After this, we're done," said Three. "You're the last person we're ever going to kill." The two took a deep breath and spoke in unison. "Farewell." Off in some far-flung region of Calvard, a horse-drawn carriage plodded along. Aside from trains, most terrestrial transportation had long since switched to orbital cars, so such an old-fashioned mode of travel was a rare sight to see. The more rustic method did have its certain undeniable charm, however. A boy drove the carriage, while a young girl of about the same age lay within. "It makes you wonder how he got that way," the boy said, thinking back to the Emperor's face. The one had been obscured by both cloak and helmet. His appearance had been a poor fit for his monstrous behavior. If anything, he'd have been rather handsome. "Well, if you don't mind rumors and hearsay, I might have an answer or two for you." The girl's response came from within the carriage, delivered in her usual sleepy drawl. "I'm listening." "Well," the girl's story went something like this. In a small country in some corner of the world, there once lived a vile, oppressive king. His reign was tyrannical, his rule evil, and his people lived in fear. One day he died, and his son, the crown prince, was enthroned. The prince, this new king, was, at his core, a kind and gentle soul who strove to govern in a fair and just manner. He was determined to avoid his father's errors, but perhaps they were too accustomed to fear and no one met the new king's ideas with an open mind. Free assembly and speech had already been brutally suppressed during his father's reign, and the people's rage had already reached a boiling point. Violent voices grew louder and louder, eventually resulting in a revolution. The Revolutionary Army launched an assault on the royal palace and forcibly converted the country into a republic, holding the new king accountable for his father's sins. Suddenly, finding his life at risk, he had no choice but to flee, leaving behind his country and his entire way of life. "You're telling me this prince eventually became the overseer?" the boy asked, his brow wrinkling in thought as he turned the story over in his head. "Who can say?" shrugged the girl. "I don't know if a kingdom like that even existed in the first place." The girl rolled over to continue dozing as the carriage bumped and bounded its way along the road. "Assuming this is more fact than fiction, then what?" the boy asked. "He was too kind and lost control of his kingdom, so he developed a powerful desire to control others. It's hard to believe." The boy trailed off. He had no intention of giving the overseer even a shred of sympathy, but strangely enough, he did find himself feeling a little pity for the man. The boy and girl fell silent for a few moments. The only sounds that could be heard were the clopping of the horse's hooves and the creaking of the carriage. The boy broke the silence. What is it? The girl raised her head from her nap. Her voice remained as relaxed as ever, but the boy's tone suddenly grew tense. Is there any chance you could ever forgive me for what I did? For what happened between me and your brother? No. The girl's response was swift and blunt. The boy felt silent. He had no right to scorn her answer. Never, she continued. Because he was my brother, and I loved him. He was the only real family I ever had, so... The girl paused for a moment. Her cheeks flushed red, and then she continued in a much louder voice. So if you want me to forgive you, you can't ever leave me. We need to stick together through thick and thin. You and me, N and S. The boy smiled, his fear for a moment having left him. Of course. We'll always be there for each other. I'll have your back and you'll have mine. The girl could barely contain the emotions swelling in her chest at this point. Unfortunately for her, the boy continued talking. I'll do my best to fill his shoes from now on, and that includes making sure you get the education you need to grow into the best person you can be. This was, in fact, not the answer the girl had been looking for. I'm not talking about education, she exclaimed as she started violently shaking the carriage in frustration. But what could be more important? Hey, calm down! This thing can't take too much abuse. It's rickety enough as it is. If you make it fall apart, we'll have to walk the rest of the way. The girl settled back down, still not fully satisfied with his response, but resolved to leave things be for the moment. The topic changed again. So, any ideas? For the time being, their plan was to head to Liberal or Lemon, just as the boy had initially planned. But where to from there? They had yet to give it much thought. They knew they would be pursued by any number of people from the organization. Despite this, the two knew that as long as they stuck together, they'd find a way to manage. For a moment, they revealed the idea of an unknown future, a new path to tread that was all their own. In any case, we need to find some kind of work, the boy said. Anything in mind? Well, he mused, a confident smile growing on his face. When we consider our skill set, how about something in theater? Not on your life, the girl swiftly retorted. Think about it, S. You're a terrible actor. Hey, I'm not that bad. I'm sure a play would be way less pressure than an assassination mission. A tad deflated, the boy sank into his seat, but then threw out another idea, one somewhat more plausible than the last. I know. How about we become bracers? No way. The girl rejected the idea again, but with a bit less bite than before. I've heard they get super busy. No sense escaping one grave just to work yourself into another. There was also the question hanging in the air over whether the Bracer Guild would even consider taking people with the duo's unique background. All things considered, however, it wasn't the most outlandish idea. Fine. What's your bright idea then? Me? The girl yawned. All I want to do is lay around in bed every day. Just sleep. You're ridiculous, the boy sighed. His face then lit up suddenly as he remembered something. Oh, right! What is it? Names, he said with a hint of excitement. I just realized we haven't shared our real names with each other. Oh, right. N is short for Nadia. That's my real name. Mine's Swin. Huh, the girl said, hiding a small smile. So S wasn't too far off then. Pretty crazy coincidence. There was a good reason for her nickname for him had been so close to his real name. Her brother had mentioned it in one of his letters. She had known Swin's name before their paths even crossed. After they had worked together for a bit, she decided she wanted to call him by something that resembled his actual name, rather than his organization's moniker. This, however, was something she intended to keep to herself. Well, in the end, you'll always be S to me, and I'll always be N to you, right? Yeah, you're right. The carriage continued to its slow roll forward, as did their conversation. It was profound at moments, but was otherwise silly, lighthearted, and most of all, free. The boy's name was Swin, S. The girl's name was Nadia, N. Together they were travelers. Travelers discovering their newfound humanity. The end. Well, that seems to be ending the books for now. I won't have too much to say on the story. But I will say that was quite a nice story to read, and probably one that we may revisit in a Spark Notes fashion when we reach Hajimari no Kiseki. But that is all officially for the end of Trails of Cold Steel 4. Thank you all so much for watching this project, and I hope to see you guys next time for something a little bit more dynamic, I'll say. Something that you might find it hard to escape from. Well, then, until next time, everybody, have a wonderful rest of your day, night, weekend, anything and everything. Bye bye.